G'day guys, Adam Cogan here from SSW TV, and we are live at NDC Australia, and I have two people from America here to interview. I have Elle and Jennifer. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can you tell us a little bit about your companies and where you come from? Because I know you come from different sides of the equation here, but we're going to be talking about accessibility all the way.
Sure. How about you go first?
Okay, sure. My name is Jennifer Wong, and I work for a company called Eventbrite. We ticketed this event. And I work there as a software engineer currently, and I'm fairly new to accessibility. So it's a huge interest of mine, though.
She totally undersells herself. My name is Elle Waters. I'm the Director of Strategy at Simply Accessible. And we're an organization that's devoted to helping other teams how to design and build more accessible sites and applications and kiosks and wearable technologies so that that everyone can use them. And so we do teaching, we do testing, we partner up and at the elbows design and code along with teams as well.
Awesome. So I have a website.
Yes.
And I know I should be doing alt tags everywhere. Can you explain to me what is accessibility?
So there's some very starchy definitions, and people tend to lean towards that. Our company tends to go with a very simple definition, which is for every person on every device. And the idea is making things work for everyone. So if somebody has limited mobility and they can't use a mouse and yet they want to be able to use your site, having your site completely accessible to just using a keyboard, being able to tab through everything and use arrow keys, that kind of stuff, that's an example of accessibility. And so it's really about a universal access kind of approach to making sure that everybody can use the things that you build.
And Jennifer, does it mean anything different to you?
I wouldn't say so. Yeah, I think just making essentially any good service or product usable for anybody, anywhere.
Okay. In Australia, Coles, our big retailer, has been all over the news because some guy sued them for discrimination because he couldn't use the checkout process, and he got a successful out-of-court settlement, and he got them to make their site accessible, and they've actually maybe got a big fright, and they've gone and they've had special days at Coles where they lower the lights and they help people with autism and stuff like that.
That's very cool.
Very cool. Is there similar stories exist in America and other countries?
Yes, America tends to be a very litigious country, and it's a necessary piece of the awareness building. It's usually not a great experience for companies, though. We tend to be pretty empathetic because oftentimes it's just a lack of awareness on what to do. But most companies don't get sued because of not having an accessible site. They get sued because they don't have an accessible site and they defensively resist making it accessible when it's brought to their attention. So that's something to keep in mind. There's an increasing amount of lawsuits every year. I believe the number in 2016 was over 200. One of the landmark lawsuits was in 2006 with Target, but just about every name brand that you can think of has been sort of pulled into that sort of spotlight. And at this point, it's really very, very common, and it's understood that companies need to be proactive and really think about this instead of doing it mandated by somebody else.
And what are they getting in trouble for? The same things?
Same things. I mean, it's some of the 60 to 70% of what really builds the foundation for accessibility is just best practices. So if you were to build a form, you would of course have programmatic labels for those elements, right? That seems like very standard, very straightforward. It's not just messy code, it actually locks people out of that experience. So if that person was using the checkout process in Kohl's and he was using a screen reader, he needed to know what that text input field is. So his assistive technology is looking for some of the basic best practices, and if it's not accomplished, then he doesn't have the same experience and can't necessarily complete the task.
Is this about educating developers or educating testers? Because usually developers will do what they're told to do. Usually they don't have vision problems, and they fix things that the testers report.
Depends on how expensive you want the process to be.
Yeah, in general at Eventbrite, we're looking to make things for accessibility to like incorporate all teams. And so I think it's really an overarching process that requires buy-in from the product team, from the design team, from the QA team, from the engineering team, and even from the sales and the customer support and marketing teams. They're all important in the whole process of making sure that your website is fully accessible.
And it's not only a developer issue, like Jennifer was saying, there's things that are design choices that a developer doesn't have a choice over, and implementing that according to those design specifications, it could still be inaccessible. But it is definitely an educational thing. The reason why I said is how expensive do you want it to be is if you wait for QA to catch everything, that sounds pretty costly, right? Because it's at the end of that life cycle as compared to continuous.
That's a great point.
Yeah, instead of continuous integration from a developer perspective, you don't even want to wait for that nightly build and validation. You want it to be something that anytime you're committing code that you can have like things that you're doing to check.
So,
test-driven development, it's a great thing.
Thank you. Imagine you're talking to a very large company. What is the legal minimum they have to do?
I think that depends. It depends on what countries you operate in as a business.
Let's talk America first.
Okay, well, definitely in the US first. For example, we have Section 508, and that requires WCAG 2.0 AA compliance. And that could be anything from a university, which accepts federal funding, to like a federal agency if you're a contractor with a federal agency. So you have like kind of a range, and that just sort of depends on like where you fall in the law and like what companies you are also working with.
So if you're looking for the minimum, I think the question too would be how much risk do you want to take on as a company? People with disabilities do not have a checklist with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines right next to them, and they're not hammering away at your site looking at the criteria and whether or not you've fulfilled the technical criteria. They're trying to complete a task, they're trying to buy something, they're trying to pay a bill. And so if they can't complete that task, then that raises that risk level. And so as far as minimum viable accessibility, we have ways that we approach it with teams to where we look at it in a very agile way, and we say, well, foundationally, make things wonderfully accessible with a keyboard. And then we've found that even though the keyboard accessibility requirements for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are only 30% of all the guidelines, they actually impact more than 50% of people with disabilities. So from an agile context, that's like more business value straight up front. And so if you iterate off of that and then go with the next most impacted user needs, and you continue to do that, people are not likely to file a lawsuit because they see that you're making progress and you're committed to it.
Right.
I am not a lawyer, so that is not something that someone should take.
So it's actually not that much different from load testing. You test for common scenarios, but of course there'll always be a particular possible spike that would, swamp your site. It's similar.
It's very similar. There's a lot of best practices that people do with the way that they do, like I said, test-driven development, the way that you have UX best practices, and all those things are very much aligned to the same way you should approach accessibility.
When you go and talk to companies, is your advice different for big companies versus little companies?
My sympathy for them is different. I don't think it's different in that sense. Every company has some of the same challenges. A lot of companies, when you're talking to them about accessibility, it's one thing to identify the problems and to teach them how to fix the problems. But it's really a system and process oriented thing. So it tends to be something that's, how do you actually do, all of your marketers have the ability to change the homepage without any kind of review process? Well, that has an accessibility impact. So depending on how the organization is structured, we would probably, talk differently. If we had Eventbrite as a client, though we wouldn't probably need it because they're pretty dedicated to accessibility, that's a different kind of environment because they're very, I would imagine, a very integrated team, and they have a lot of cross-functional discussions where you're not having silos that you have to, not know who's doing what. So it's a different way of working with different teams, for sure.
as you have travelled outside America, or maybe even just different states in America, but as you've seen other countries, is there any differences that are coming up, or are we just talking a vanilla set of accessibility stuff that companies should be doing?
From my perspective, I looked mostly at the US and Australia for my presentation, and in general, they essentially overlap government-wise and law-wise.
Right.
They're both looking at meeting WCAG 2.0 AA as well. So it's kind of interesting because the laws themselves in the US and Australia are less stringent than what you see put through our web standards for W3C. And so the governments actually, those two governments rely mostly on those guidelines specifically.
Right.
I think some differences are how different countries are adjusting to the advocacy within their own countries. So, so in England, there's a very big concern right now about the implications of Brexit and the support for people with disabilities and how that's going to be built in. If they don't have some of those shared pieces of support from an EU perspective, what does that mean then? And so there are, discussions within the EU about the digital marketplace, and yet that may not be something that's now available for the UK. And so there's some different implications that people have to consider. But I do think that there's a common thread throughout, that people, as they get older, are aging into disabilities. So the prevalence of disability actually increases, and people are living longer. And people have expectations to be able to do things in a digital way and to be able to have a mobile device that they can conduct transactions and have a rich and robust life and have that kind of ease of use. So the expectations are rising. The ages of people who are thriving in the workplace and that kind of stuff is rising, and disability is also rising. And so I think that sort of is all coming to a head, but it's pretty much across different countries that we worked with.
Right. What about people that don't speak English? Is supporting other languages, does that fall into accessibility?
It can. Do you guys have like multi-language support for Eventbrite?
We do, yeah, for the countries that we operate within. We actually have an engineering office in Argentina, and so they're trained up on accessibility testing. VoiceOver has accessibility, access to different languages within VoiceOver.
Right.
So you can actually test in Spanish or English. So they'll do both down in Argentina. They'll be testing in both languages. And actually there's specifically an Argentinian Spanish voice that you can use for
That's
VoiceOver.
very cool.
Ah, very nice.
So yeah, assistive technology is totally up for that. The only thing that makes it different at times is if you have like a right to left reading language.
Yes, so
So
could I be
that-
sued by some Arabic guy that reads right to left where it's not supported?
Well, it's not even so much from a technical perspective, because you can do all of those things, but it's from a design perspective. There's assumptions that people make about user task flows, and those of us who read left to right are thinking about moving something across a spectrum, or if you're using a widget and doing things. You just have to be conscious of it, and it's the same thing. And to Jennifer's point, there's alt text that you might put on an image, and that image is read aloud using a screen reader, and you just need to account for that with different languages.
And do you support right to left? Eventbrite?
I don't think you have any
Not at this time.
On the backlog.
Yeah, it's on the product roadmap.
Awesome. Now, Troy Hunt, he was just here at the conference, and he's telling people, developers get more serious with security. You can go to saferweb.com and put in your URL. It'll tell you some, starting things to fix up. Do you have something similar?
There's a lot of things available that can run an automated scan for you. The great thing about automated scans are that they give you a lot of very clear, easy identifiable kind of issues. The not so great thing is it only identifies about 25% of the issues that might be on the page, but there's a lot of those tools out there that you can at least get a good start and know, if I run this automated tool. There's some that actually are APIs as well. You can build it into, you use
build
Seleniums
process.
or Jenkins, and any of the kind of technology stack you use, you can put that in there, and that gives you that boost. Do you guys use, what do you guys use for automated testing? Do you do any of that, or is it mostly manual testing, what you do?
We have like Jenkins as part of our build process, and so we run an acceptance test suite, and then
That's
all
great.
of our acceptance tests are actually written manually.
Yeah, that's great.
So that's something we do. We also have Totally built into both
yeah.
our dev and QA environments, so engineers can
great.
test as they're coding.
That's
And then
awesome.
we have several linters depending on what language we're writing in. For example, right now we're migrating a lot of our site over to React and Redux, and so we use a JSX linter. So anytime somebody decides to compile their code and tries to push it up, there's going to be an error if it's not accessible.
That's great.
I just went to the Build conference in Seattle. I took my little girl with me, and she watched the session. It was all about artificial intelligence, and she was lucky enough to ask Sally Nadella, the CEO, a question, and said, "What is the best possible product that Microsoft could ever make with all this AI stuff?" And his answer was he said, the best possible thing we could do is make a great product for the disabled. Why is this so front and center for the big CEOs? Is this just legal reasons?
No, it's usually not what drives innovation. So recognizing that the more inclusive you are, the more of your customers that you include in that mix. That's kind of the math of it. Also recognizing that the more you make something accessible to people with disabilities, the more you make it accessible and usable to everyone. It's a design thinking. It's sort of a paradigm shift for people. And once they start thinking inclusively about the way to build something, there's huge opportunities. It's also, in my opinion, a civil right. I think it's a human right that people should have the same access to the kinds of things that other people have. It's not unachievable, you know. It's really available to anybody to do, and it's a matter of education. And
what percentage of people are companies missing out on by being not worrying about accessibility?
you get to say it. There's a quote that a lot of us
there's 15% of the world's population live with disabilities. And so based on those numbers from the World Health Organization, you could say maybe, or based on numbers of internet users as well, you can estimate about 7.5% of the internet usage with accessible needs is that much. So 7.5%.
That's a lot of customers.
Yeah.
It is. It's a lot of customers. It makes good business sense.
I thought we were talking percentage points, like very small.
No, it's a lot of people, and people, are always changing. And so the idea of, I said this earlier in my talk, that the number of people in this room who are aging into disabilities is everyone. At some point, we all get older, our eyesight starts failing, people might get cataracts, there might be tremors, hand tremors, and it's difficulty using a mouse. So it really is building for future self. It's building for 15% of your population, of your customer base.
But there is a problem there. Like, this is expensive to retrofit websites and make it.
Yes.
And if you're talking, let's say 10% of our user base, we would get a benefit, but we would get a bigger benefit by supporting Spanish, or even bigger supporting Mandarin. Shouldn't that go above on the backlog than the accessibility?
I'm a big believer in building it correctly from the beginning, and that retrofitting is more expensive, but it's not as expensive if all the other practices that have been built in have been correct. If people use components, if they have a design system, then it's much less expensive, because then they're looking at things at the interaction level. If they use templates, that also is very useful. And it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not that you either go all the way in and you decide you're going to make something fully accessible, or you shouldn't even try. The idea is you should be looking at continuous improvements, and if you're looking at continuous improvements, build that into your process.
I agree with that. So if you have a boss, you're sold on accessibility, but your boss is not, what is a good technique to frighten the bejesus out of him?
The W3C actually has some fantastic tools about building the business case, and even presentation materials that people can use. The business case differs according to who you're talking to. So if I'm talking to an IT software manager, I'm going to talk about the standardization and efficiency gains, because to make something accessible is to really kind of require that things become more standardized. But if I'm talking to a marketer, I'm going to talk about the percentage of customers that they're actually not reaching out to. So it depends on the audience and what their measures of success are.
One of the engineers who sort of pioneered the accessibility movement at Eventbrite essentially put together a presentation that talked about 4 sections of benefits, which included sales, so how much money you could be making and how much money we're losing out on, legal reasons, which we could be sued. And
Fear,
then,
uncertainty, and doubt. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Usually gets them.
and especially with the legal, it's not just the money, but also just the amount of time you would have to meet compliance. You have less time once you have a ruling put against you.
It becomes, you're on their timeline. That's a really great point. And whatever marketing objectives you had, if you were going to roll out a new feature, that may have to take a back seat, because now you're under the pressure of having to do something else. And you have to devote all of your attention to that. And it may or may not be the way you intended to do it. And that's happened before with the organizations.
Right, exactly.
And that's tough. That's really tough, because you may want to go further with that. The people who succeed long term with accessibility are the people who really think about it from a user experience point of view. And so you may want to actually get to know what your customers with disabilities would prefer for features or how they use something. But if you're under the legal pressure of having to suddenly report back externally what your progress is, it's unlikely that you'll be able to do anything other than kind of meet the minimum standard to be able to take that pressure off. And that's unfortunate, because nobody really wins out of that.
No, that'd be terrible.
The other couple of points that we also brought up were internationalization. So having things that are accessible automatically helps you expand out to international markets. And then of course the consumer side of things, and it just being the right thing to do and making your website accessible for many more people.
People who build really accessible websites are also people who are primed for building more responsive sites, who understand how to really appeal to their mobile users, because those have a lot of crossover as well. And so, to Jennifer's point, there's areas that you're basically preparing for success if you build things in an accessible way, because you're basically future-proofing what you're doing.
In the DevOps space, we've got some golden children, Netflix, etc. But is there some golden children in the accessible space? Some great websites that...
It's difficult. Websites are always changing. So there are different kinds of areas that I think are exceptional. I think Apple actually does a really good job, and the technologies that they release are pretty amazing. I think Google tends to do a pretty good job. A lot of the technology companies, Microsoft has some amazing things that they're doing, and you can see the evidence of a commitment to accessibility. I can't list any current clients, and so if I start going too far into that,
Any
it
beautiful
might be
websites that are perfectly accessible that you like to use as the quintessential example?
Sure, simplyaccessible.com.
Oh, yes, that'd be a good
Because
one.
I know who built it, and I can be pretty sure that I can go to sleep tonight and know I have no concerns.
Is there any things that you would, in a discussion, allow, you can fix that one later? I'm just trying to think of
How do you guys
helping
prioritize?
companies.
Sure. How do
Yeah.
you guys prioritize your fixes?
So we actually had Web AIM, or Web Accessibility in Mind, do an audit on our consumer flows, and so they prioritize things in 4 levels, and so we essentially prioritize it based on that. So the first one is just a completely unusable user flow from the perspective of accessible needs, and so all of those tickets get prioritized right away. And it sort of depends on time as well. So if you have a small amount of time, like an hour, you could pick up an accessibility bug that would take about that amount of time. So we definitely have priority for those higher level tickets, but those also take a longer amount of time. So it sort of depends. Personally, I work on a feature team, so accessibility is not the only thing I do. And so I have to kind of squeeze in accessibility while I'm working on the features. And so right now, those larger tickets are kind of taking a back seat to my feature work, but at some point when I actually have the time, those are the things that I'll work on first.
Yeah, we look at things, like Jennifer's saying, in order of user impact. We also help teams look at things. If they're planning on rolling out a redesign, say within 3 months, it may not be the best use of their time to focus on these particular issues that have been identified. If they know that it would be better to focus that effort in designing the redesigned experience in an accessible way, then it's, you know, it's always a prioritization kind of discussion. And some things are an annoyance to people with disabilities. Sometimes people will go over the top and they'll put a lot of title attributes and alt attributes on a lot of things, and that creates a huge amount of verbosity for people with screen readers. That's not as deep of an impact as creating a keyboard trap and somebody gets into an iframe and they can't get out of it without just closing the browser window. So obviously there's different impacts, and so you want to consider that as far as what you're deciding to spend your efforts on. But I think it's great too, the idea that what Jennifer said, some things are simple. Some things are so simple and straightforward that it's easy to put that into your, you know, your sprint backlog and just go ahead and take care of it.
I think as Elle was talking about, like in terms of prioritization and future thinking versus like retrofitting what you're doing. At Eventbrite, for example, we're working on a new design system, and so we have these reusable, accessible components. Yeah. And so a lot of our focus is on that, rather than trying to retrofit all of this, all of these web pages that actually will just be taken over by that design system anyways.
So it sounds like, just from the descriptions of problems, it's not as simple as just throwing a URL into some rating engine and telling you whether you've got to get testers to go through this and experience it. It's very arbitrary, really, isn't it?
It's not arbitrary because it's based on what people are able to do. And there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines does provide a somewhat generic kind of approach to it. But if you look at user task flows and you put that against what different user needs are, you can get pretty specific and build out the test cases like Jennifer's talking about. And the better test cases are those that are built for your system and your, you know, your product. But you can do that, and it does take some time, but the more worthwhile investment is exactly what she and Eventbrite, you know, and that team is doing, where you spend that effort in your design system. It's the most brilliant, strategic, and efficient way to be able to do something.
But that's doing it up front, right?
Yeah, doing it up front. So it may not always be the best use of your time to decide to remediate an entire legacy site if you know that you can put that effort into redesigning things, because then you have, you know, basically a crappy site that's old, but it's somewhat accessible. That's not really a big win for anybody. Whereas if you put that effort into something that's, you know, built with React components, and you've really done a lot of testing and you've really done a lot of design thinking, then everybody, you know, it's great for everyone then afterwards.
Well, I love customers that want to start again, and developers love that. That's not always easy to sell.
Yeah.
What are some of the, like, obviously testing, tab, making sure it all works. What are some of the really difficult stories you've had, or some of the difficult parts to get right in accessibility?
Modals.
What was that?
Modals.
Modals. Oh.
Yeah.
And I think to Jennifer's point, probably the largest, most complex kind of things we see is lack of focus management. So the idea of knowing where your cursor is going to go with every user interaction, especially when you're looking at, say, single page apps. Single page apps don't have to be difficult from an accessibility point of view, but you have to manage the focus rigorously, and you have to really know what's going to happen. So that tends to be more complex. Date pickers, modal dialogues, autocomplete features, almost all of these have to do with managing focus.
Really?
Error messaging. Yeah.
Error notifications. Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes.
So, and yet, again, create the pattern, and then you don't have to go through that pain again. Don't use 5 different date pickers on your site, please.
So if I'm tabbing through a form and an error, you know, is shown in the top bar, how does someone that's blind see that? Because they don't see something pop at the top of the screen. They're reading down the screen. So
are you talking about field level error messaging?
I'm talking about Ajax.
Right. Are you talking about field level error messaging, or are you talking about up at the top of the page?
Well, I'm just the concept of where you would, I assume, if you're blind, you're reading, using a screen reader to read down the page. And as you are entering something down here and something injects in the page using Ajax at the top, you wouldn't see, hey, you've just done something wrong, would you?
Screen readers have this fantastic bridge technology that was created. It's called Accessible Rich Internet Application, and ARIA for short. And screen readers, modern screen readers, are built to receive messages called ARIA Live. And so you would put that attribute on that message. And we recommend polite, because that means that when that person's done with a task, then it will read that out loud. And it doesn't move the focus, but it gives them dynamic updates. So for example, if somebody is using a screen reader and they enter a chat room, there's people coming and going and leaving and people talking in the chat room. There's a lot of activity happening, right? Or a stock ticker and things like that, you know, when you're on a site. There's a lot of activity that may be happening on the page, and you may not want to take the user to that place, right? When you need to take the user to that place, the screen reader will announce it. But if you just need them to be aware of that information, then there's a way to be able to code for that. And if it's something that absolutely has to interrupt whatever they're doing, then you change it to a different kind of attribute, which is an ARIA Live region that is coded as assertive. So there's technology for that. It's pretty fantastic.
So am I allowed to inject a message or not at the top?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and the screen readers will
Sure.
take care of that, so
Yep.
nothing to worry about.
Well, you have to do it properly, but yes.
Okay, that one's starting to sound expensive. All right. So is there benefits that the existing users, the all users, get when I implement accessibility features for the small percentage of users?
Yes.
Oh, yes,
That
tell me.
was an easy question to answer. So if you're going to be making something more accessible, you're going to make it easier to use. Things that are easier to use, typically people complete tasks, they'll buy something more readily, more easily. If you teach your developers how to create, your designers how to create error messaging that allows people to recover from problems, then everyone is going to benefit from that. If you are thinking in terms of color contrast, for example, there's all kinds of people who would benefit from a better color contrast on your site, instead of having to squint, look in, and try and understand that, especially mobile users. So those are the two that come to mind.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would definitely say the same. I recently started wearing glasses for near vision, and so having like more color contrast, having more obvious like font sizing and thickness really helps me read things. And I've started to notice when like font is really thin, and I'm like, I can't read that, and I've got to go get my glasses out. So, yeah, you start to empathize more, I think, as Elle said, as you start to age as well.
Yeah.
So if I implement some accessibility features for the small subset, is there ever a case where you make it worse for the majority of users?
I've never encountered that.
Never?
I've never encountered it when you're doing it from the beginning. If you're retrofitting, you're going to be dealing with some other design that's already been laid out, and so there's going to be maybe some bad choices with design that have been made. But if you look at it from the beginning, you approach it with accessibility in mind from the beginning, there's never been a situation where people don't have a way to do something that they can do well. That's my experience.
Jennifer?
There was one time one of our engineers wanted to make a slideshow accessible by creating a way to pause, play, and stop that animation, and he didn't get design's buy-in on how he designed that button. So it didn't make the experience worse for anyone. It just had a really ugly button on it for a short bit of time. But I mean, that can be easily remedied by speaking with design about how to actually make that button incorporate into the page better. But other than that, I mean, that's not really a user issue so much as just a visual thing.
We did have one experience where we had to think a little differently too. So oftentimes when you look at, say, an autocomplete feature or drop-down combo box, mouse users like the ability to be able to open it, and upon clicking one of those selections, whatever is meant to happen with that interaction happens, right? That's a real affordance and help for people who are mouse users. It doesn't work well for keyboard users, because in order for them to open that combo box and they hit a down arrow, the very first thing that they select, they'll never get to the bottom because it will act as though it's an event, triggered and fired. So what we did to solve for that was we had it scripted so it would detect keyboard usage and a button would appear. And so then it became a different kind of interaction based on detecting that keyboard usage. So you might have to be clever sometimes,
yes.
but.
And the cost of this, like, none of this is free, and this is more discussions and more learning with everybody in the team. Assuming we have like a few developers and a designer on a small part of the project, how much extra cost is this, like, generally?
It's going to change over time based on the learning curve. So I would be really curious what you think as far as how much extra effort has it been for you guys, and where's that change happen?
So I'd say for us, I couldn't put necessarily a dollar amount to it, but
Percentage?
I'm not sure about that either. But for example, after our audit with WebAIM, we estimated that we would have about 2 tickets per team of engineers per sprint for about 10 sprints. So each sprint is about 2 weeks. So that was maybe 3 months of work then, about 3 to 4 months of work. And that's not many tickets, that's maybe 1 ticket per person, but the number of hours ranged from, half an hour to like several days, depending on the ticket.
Right.
But if you think about it, and at that number of tickets and that level of work, it's really only about 4 months in order to meet the compliance that we were looking to meet. And everything gained back from that after talking about benefits in terms of sales and like legality and like users and internationalization is, I think, just so much more than those 4 months and 2 tickets per team over that time.
That's a great point. Yeah, we've seen teams be able to fix things in that time frame. We've seen teams that are kind of, to be honest, troubled. They have their own internal problems as far as the way that they're structured, the way they work. If their process isn't a good process, it's going to be more effort for them to be able to do that. If they're kind of resistant to wanting to do that, or there's politics going on inside, that's going to extend the amount of effort that it takes. But teams that end up getting mature in their process and understand how to do that, I think to Jennifer's point, the investment they put into it is the same thing as if you decided you wanted to make something, responsive. There's a learning curve to be able to get to that point.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But then the benefits afterwards, you just don't ever want to look back.
No.
And so it's pretty much the same.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do a site that wasn't responsive. It's
At
a
this
great
point, but
example.
at some point you had to learn,
Yes.
and you had to decide what those breakpoints were, and you had to decide what the layout would look like at those breakpoints. And so there was a design consideration. Then there was, how are we building this for these different devices? You had to do testing that was different, and all of that required a certain amount of training and a certain amount of experimentation and learning, and then it becomes just how you do this.
Right.
Right.
It's the same thing.
At Eventbrite, we like to say that accessibility is really similar to performance, where it's nobody's job and also everybody's job. So,
That's great.
like
When it's
being-
everyone's job, nobody does it.
well, hopefully everybody does it if you're at the right company.
Which, a good example. All right, so the boss, you've sold him.
Yes.
The designer, you've sold him.
Yes.
A couple of devs, you've sold them. You've got a couple of devs, don't care too much for this. Not very empathetic. How do you keep track? How do you, like, they're making changes, they're adding new PBIs, but they're not checking for accessibility. How do you keep your eye on them?
From a developer perspective, I think QA is going to find that, right? If that's in your measures of success.
Are you watching, are you looking at diffs, or are you looking at
Yeah.
check-ins? What are you doing? What do you
So
do?
for us, we have like kind of a small group of mostly known accessibility advocates, and so we tend to watch all of the diffs that are coming through. So we'll get email notifications on essentially every diff that's tagged with accessibility, or for me personally, I get tagged on anything that has changes to CSS or HTML, and or to our accessibility acceptance tests. So I can actually see when people are changing things, and I just kind of like keep an eye on things, and I know that the other accessibility advocates that are throughout our engineering organization are keeping an eye on that as well. So we'll tend to leave comments like, are you sure you want to remove that alt tag? Are you sure you want to like just leave that blank? Or is this particular feature going to be accessible as you ship it? And then once in a while, you're just generally testing the website as you go through as well. So we'll be like, I'm going to create a Jira ticket and just assign it to this team, and they can take care of it.
So that is awesome. You're actually watching the check-ins and you're correcting them. So you're like the accessibility Nazi.
Well, I wouldn't want to use that word to describe myself.
Especially not these days as an American.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think I love the fact that it's like near real time and collaborative, and I think that your process tends to support it. So usually any of those automated tests that you build into your system have at least a way of kind of doing a little bit of a smoke test. If you build a pattern library and a component library, you can build your own JavaScript to be able to test for deviations from the pattern, which is great, because then it changes the level of what you're actually being able to detect by saying somebody decided to roll their own modal dialog and it doesn't look like anything in our component library. Well, that tells you a lot about your own standards as well as accessibility. But in my experience, developers are the easiest to convince to do accessible development. They love it. There's clarity and it's a skill set, and developers love learning about new things. And as long as the measures of success and how to do it are clearly laid out, which is really where people fail them, then they embrace it. That's usually not a big fight. They're very eager to learn.
So I guess last question before we take some questions from the audience. We have been talking about websites mostly. I guess we think about that all the time. But when you go into the real world, what other things need accessibility other than websites? So
we work a lot with wearable technologies and kiosks, both airline kiosks and in-store kiosks, and a lot of native apps as well. We're starting to move into virtual reality and augmented reality as well. There's some great things happening in that space. Kind of early still, but Internet of Things is definitely something that is sort of surfacing with the clients that we work with as well. But you guys?
I'd say nothing specifically with Eventbrite. The first thing that comes to mind is I actually used to work as a civil engineer, and so we definitely had to consider accessibility to, example, doors.
Build space.
Like making sure that the ramps are correctly designed so that people don't go just like falling off this ramp.
Right.
Yeah, so that was something that we had to consider in terms of physical spaces.
Awesome. So I know you want to ask some questions. How about we take a couple of questions? Up at the mic. Yep.
So this isn't so much a question, as more an observation around accessibility. So when people think about accessibility, they think, right, I need to think about people who are blind, I need to think about people who don't have mobility. Now, this isn't always the target audience that we're addressing. So I work for a company based in New Zealand called E-Road, and we build software and hardware for the trucking industry. And when you think about the trucking industry, especially thinking about truck drivers, you don't think about accessibility. These are drivers. They have eye tests to prove that they can see when they're driving their vehicles. They have mobility tests to make sure that they can physically drive their vehicles. But you're looking at 3 million people in the US who drive trucks at an average age of 55, usually overweight because they eat bad foods, they've got big fat fingers. Usually their eyesight is not so good close up. How many 55-year-olds do you see lifting up the glasses to read a device? And these are also people who usually have limited intellect as well. So when we're building a mobile app for truckers, we actually have to think about these things. We have to think about the normal day-to-day accessibility of the older generation of people. So it's very important that we don't just think, oh, I know my drivers, they're not going to be blind, it's going to be fine. But we have to think, well, actually, who is our audience? Who uses it? So what problems do they have, and how can we address that? And then kind of going back to your point about how do you justify the cost, that's 3.6 million people who can use our app. If we don't make it accessible, that's 3.6 million people who can't use our app. So it pays for itself. It takes us a few days to think about, let's make big buttons, let's make simple text, and that pays for itself in spades because more people can access our app. So as an observation, there's a lot of accessibility things people need to think of above and beyond what we normally assume is just the standard accessibility issues of this person can't see, this person doesn't have mobility.
Well, this
great.
Kiwi's sold.
I know, that's great. I love that too, because it's really from this holistic and very personalized idea of think about the actual user experience. And so, I mean, from the developer community, I think that the stats would prove that 1 in 8 male developers is colorblind. And I would argue, even though I've never done the math, it's probably higher, because I tend to meet more developers who are colorblind than 1 in 8. And so if you think about that, the applications that developers use, I mean, we've been talking about customers and end users, but even developers need, you know, those kinds of accommodations as well. And people don't think about that for developers, and yet it's pretty common.
Yeah, I think additionally, a lot of people don't think of all of these disabilities as on a spectrum.
Yeah.
So yeah, as you said, it's like it really depends on the user base, and people tend to think, oh, blind, deaf, but you may, you know, just have some hearing issues. You may be hard of hearing. You may just have low vision, or you may have like cataracts, for example. So those are things that people definitely don't think about until you delve more into this.
Well, with that, did you want to ask a question? All right. We'll just take one more.
I'm not tall enough. So I was thinking that in Microsoft we invented a lot of technology almost accidentally as a result of trying to make improvements for people with disabilities, and it's been things that could then help other people. So for example, in Skype, we made it so that people who were deaf could use Skype because it would automatically caption the words as they were talking. And from that, they had the next idea of maybe we could do, you know, auto-translate, so I could speak in English and my parents-in-law will get the translation in French, like while you're Skyping, which is like magic. Have you seen any examples like that of things that have, you know, really benefited the wider world as a result of trying just to improve it for someone with disability?
That's fantastic, that question. Absolutely. Just about everything that's convenient about people's mobile devices, a lot of those things came out of designing and developing for disability. So Siri or Cortana or any of those kind of things, the text-to-speech concept, that's all basically was built out of a need to support people with disabilities.
Really?
Yes. So that's, to
Wow.
me, I think about what we assume are just, you know, like, exactly. And Microsoft's one of the ones that are typically, Microsoft and Apple are the ones that are really on the forefront of that, where they design some amazing applications and it just becomes sort of second nature to us. But yeah, there's a lot of things on mobile phones that actually I think in particular.
Well, talking about Skype, and we have Microsoft in the room, but I've been using Skype forever, and then all of a sudden the latest update makes it look like Snapchat or something, and now I'm disabled. I can't use it, I can't navigate around it. I know that it probably makes the younger people it's more natural, but gee, it's not very accessible for me anymore.
You might ask about how much user testing has been done for,
I think we got the young people
persona.
testing it. Yes, well, anyway, it's been fantastic. Thank you, Elle. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. This is Adam Cogan signing off for SSW TV.